Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. We're going on a bit of a fascinating intellectual journey today to unpack the very concept of the self. Look, we live in an era where literally everything around us is in constant flux, right? Our technologies, our environments, our social circles. And with all of this external shifting, well, we naturally start to look inward. So today, we're exploring identity in an age of change. We're going to deconstruct the self, but actually, scratch that. We're not just looking at what it is, we're going to test its absolute limits. But before we try to neatly define who we are, we have to ask ourselves a slightly unsettling question. Is our identity actually incredibly delicate? We usually think of our identity as our bedrock, right? This solid foundation that keeps us grounded no matter what life throws at us. But what if it's more like glass, susceptible to shattering under the pressure of a new job, a massive cross-country move, or a rapidly shifting culture? That's the exact tension we need to confront right out of the gate. How fragile is your identity, really? To make sense of this, we're going to follow a quick, structured path. We'll start with the rogue culture identity crisis, look at the thesis that identity is fragile, hit the antithesis by asking who even needs it, and then wrap up with a deep dive synthesis. So let's kick things off with part 1, the rogue culture identity crisis. The inspiration for today's exploration stems directly from the Rogue Culture series and the really compelling book Rogues in Paradise. If you aren't familiar, this work looks closely at characters, rogues, who exist just slightly outside conventional societal boundaries. Think of the people who totally reject the standard corporate ladder, or the nomadic types who absolutely refuse to settle down into those traditional suburban expectations. By looking at people who basically ignore the usual rules, we get this perfect psychological playground. We get to see exactly how identity operates when the traditional guardrails of society are completely removed. I mean, who are you when society isn't actively telling you who to be? Now, what's really interesting here is how this completely flips the script on traditional psychology. Usually, psychology gets so bogged down trying to put us into neat little personality boxes. But this approach, it says, rather than discovering what identity is, we ask how fragile it might be, and whether we need it at all. It's a total game changer for how we process our own self-awareness. Instead of just chasing a dictionary definition of the self, we are actively testing the structural integrity of who we think we are. And that brings us to part 2, establishing our core thesis. Identity is fragile. So the crucial point here is that we must first investigate this extreme fragility. How easily can identity change? Think about your own life for a second. If you move to a brand new city where literally nobody knows your name, or you go through a massive life event like becoming a parent, does your core identity stay completely intact? Or does it instantly morph to fit that new container? We love finding comfort in permanence, right? We assume our true self is unwavering. But this idea suggests a really high degree of vulnerability to the winds of change. We adapt, we shift, and suddenly, who we were yesterday kind of feels like a stranger. And you can't ask about the fragility of something without immediately wondering about its actual value. It's a totally natural feedback loop. Think about it like this. If a tool breaks every single time you try to use it, you're obviously going to start asking why you're even keeping it in your toolbox. The exact same logic applies to us. If identity changes so easily, why does it matter? Why do we care so deeply about defining ourselves if that definition is so precarious? That tension brings us directly into part 3, our antithesis. Who needs it? We really have to agitate this problem. If our sense of self is just a shifting target, who needs identity anyway? Seriously, if identity is just some temporary costume we put on depending on our environment, our age, or just the people we happen to be hanging out with, then investing massive amounts of psychological energy into finding ourselves might be a complete waste of time. Why lock down a definitive version of you if that version is basically guaranteed to be obsolete by tomorrow? It's a question that acts like a necessary wrecking ball to all our preconceived notions of self-discovery. Which finally leads us to part 4, the deep dive synthesis. By looking at these two absolute extremes, we can see exactly what identity is not. On one hand, identity is not a concrete statue. It isn't completely fixed, rigid, and immune to the elements of time and experience. But on the other hand, if we acknowledge that we still need some kind of internal compass to navigate the world, well, it can't just be a puff of smoke either, right? Entirely meaningless and completely formless. We've effectively eliminated the edges here, leaving us to figure out what actually exists in that vast space between the statue and the smoke. And the ultimate synthesis reveals this beautifully nuanced middle ground. Identity may be neither fixed nor meaningless. It is a flexible, adaptable framework. It's fragile enough to change when necessary, which allows us to actually grow and evolve, but it's substantial enough to give our lives meaning, structure, and direction. It's not a heavy iron anchor holding you rigidly in place. It's much more like a dynamic sail. It catches the wind, allowing you to move forward and navigate whatever waters you happen to find yourself in. So as you reflect on this delicate balance between permanence and meaninglessness, I want you to consider how your own evolving nature will shape your tomorrow. Because if your identity isn't fixed, you are absolutely not trapped by who you were yesterday. But since it isn't meaningless, the choices you make today hold incredible power. So in an age of constant change, who will you actively choose to be tomorrow?